Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation in the Welcome Change series. I am Barb Steele, Executive Director of Ashoka Canada, and I am part of a global network of amazing social entrepreneurs such as Joel Heath, who's here with us today, and his colleagues at SIKU, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network. At Ashoka Canada, we begin all our important conversations with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to take us through one now. I humbly acknowledge that I am participating in this call from Toronto, Canada, that is the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. In this treaty, the dish represents the land that is to be shared, and the spoon represents the individuals using the resources of this land in the spirit of mutual cooperation. And I was thinking about the relevance of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in light of this conversation, and importantly, the land in the far north where Joel's work is located that we must share in the spirit of mutual cooperation. So I invite everyone on this call from across all the lands that you inhabit to take a moment, think about and acknowledge the land that we're on as we center ourselves for this important conversation. Today we will hear from Joel about how he and his colleagues are doing some fascinating work that you may not have heard about, harnessing information about changing sea ice and the environment in the far north, and how they're using this information to advance conservation and social justice. And I'm so pleased to be hosting this conversation, lifting up Joel's approach as such an amazing example of how Ashoka Fellows are creating roles for everyone to bring their best selves forward to help solve our urgent problems such as climate change. So Joel, let's begin by inviting you to introduce yourself. So tell us who you are and how you came to be doing this kind of work.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Joel Heath. I'm the Executive Director of the Arctic Eider Society. We're a small charity based in Seneca-Nunavut, Nunavut, with the Inuit majority of our board of directors, and our programs are driven by community priorities and ongoing consultation. We made a film called People of a Feather that was kind of the catalyst for creating the charity to turn that knowledge into action for environmental stewardship and Inuit self-determination and community-driven research and education and environmental stewardship. Um, yeah, so I've been working closely with Inuit and Seneca-Nunavut for 20 years. I have a background, PhD in biology and math, and they said, "Congrats, doctor, but you're still kindergarten in Inuit Taimaitakanga. You've got lots to learn," and they convinced me to give up the academics to learn from Inuit hunters and help support, especially Lucas Argutangnak, who's a founding board member, his vision of bringing together Indigenous knowledge and science frameworks. And so I've been helping do that for the last decade.
Amazing. And Joel, so you're also a filmmaker. So you're a filmmaker and a mathematician, and now you're with technology and traditional knowledge. Can you talk about how you came to be focused on this aspect of your work?
Yeah, for sure. So I was using a camera to study animal behavior, animal economics, looking at eiders diving underneath the ice. So it was initially, I mean, I've done photography for a long time, but it was as a tool to study wildlife ecology and environmental change, using time lapse for similar sorts of things. So the idea to make People of a Feather was inspired by seeing Indigenous-led film At Najawet, the Fast Runner, had just come out, and everyone in Seneca-Nunavut was excited about it, and we were getting really good footage of eiders diving underneath the ice, and we're like, maybe we can do something too. And that's kind of what started it, and the process of engaging the community to be involved in every stage of the process, and almost every family to be involved. And the same background there about like what's appropriate for engagement and consultation, and it really being driven by and for the community. The same thing that applies for research is also applies for filmmaking and sorts of things as well. So we made People of Feather. It was a one-off. I didn't give up my academic career to become a filmmaker. I would still do some natural history stuff, and we use a lot of multimedia to for training and outreach and related to our programs. But what I did give up academics for was Indigenous knowledge frameworks and helping support self-determination and showing how Inuit and Indigenous communities, their knowledge isn't just anecdotal storytelling. There's real science, there's real data that, and with the right tools and support, when they're sitting across the table from academics and industry and government, that they can be empowered, that they're not written off as that knowledge being anecdotal, that there's real value and quantitative information there, and to help support that role for a more equitable approach across the table and for self-determination in research, climate change monitoring, equality, environmental justice, all those things. So.
Yeah. So Joel, I know you're a tech and data guy. So could you give us a couple of examples of how this type of traditional knowledge is impacting decision making or actions taken?
Yeah, absolutely. So the SIKU app is probably the thing we need to introduce a little bit to give a bit
Yeah.
more background about how that works. And so the idea was, Inuit are out there every single day. Researchers come up and visit for a couple of weeks. They might leave some instruments and go home for a while, right? But Inuit are there every single day. They're harvesting animals. They see what's happening on a daily basis, right? And they have kind of their context, and even like around the language frameworks, right? So Inuit have an Inuktitut dialects that have a classification system for different kinds of ice. And you can compare it to what the Canadian Ice Service has and what ice services around the world have for their categories. And the science categories are mostly about how icebreakers break them or they sink the Titanic or whatever. But like Inuit knowledge around ice is about how it changes with the seasons, how Inuit travel on top of the ice by dog team or now SIKU, how you boat through it, how animals use it, and how it relates to the seasonal changes. So there's a lot of words in Inuktitut dialects that there's not equivalents in English or in science because they have a more detailed classification system. So part of it's about language preservation, and we're talking about ice, but a big concept here is about Indigenous environmental terminology more generally, right? It's supporting language preservation, supporting using your own language, your own knowledge system to document environmental change, and being able to empower that through the same ways you can tag a person on Facebook. Let's make taggable wiki profiles that help build up that Indigenous knowledge around language and environmental terminology. And so in addition to ice, on the SIKU app, there's wildlife, there's traditional place names that, it's not just on a map in the wall or in a file cabinet when you're on the land. You can see where you are on a GPS for navigation with your own place names, which speak a lot to the ecological context and cultural context of those places. And that's when you remember it, that place-based learning.
Right.
And we're looking to expand that to other sorts of climate change monitoring. And so backing up a little bit around how the other side of creating SIKU as a way is like, so I mentioned there Inuit have been out there every single day, and Elder Peter Katuk, who passed away a couple of years ago, was a real motivator and helped really design a lot of our programs generally, and SIKU in particular. With Lucacy, thinking about, how can Inuit knowledge and science come together? How can these two sorts of systems? And the big difference is that scientists are trained to write down everything in excruciating detail on paper, and Indigenous knowledge is often based in oral history, until more recently anyways. And so, for example, Peter was noticing at the flow edge in the winter, he was there every single day, that the seals that he was collecting, that he was harvesting for his family, were having a lot less fish in the stomach and more shrimp showing up. So showing, that there's potentially some large scale ecosystem shifts happening in Hudson Bay with climate change, and affects him because he's not bringing home fish with seals anymore that he likes to eat and his family likes to eat. So the idea was, he's seeing that, and he's not, but it hasn't been written down. But he's out there every day. He's talking to other elders and hunters. There's a peer review system, and how do we move? Like, so he would share that with the scientists or government, and the typical response was, "That's really interesting, but it's anecdotal. We need the data. All right, let's collect some data." And they would spend 5 years and a whole bunch of money and then they go back and say, "Look, guess what? You were right all along." And then it's like, okay, well, you just wasted all this time, and just to prove what I told you was already true, right? And so the difference was, Peter's out there every day. If you take a picture and you can tag animals the same way as you can tag people on Facebook, that they have these wiki sorts of taggable profiles, indigenous environmental terminology profiles, then the same way that Inuit have been using social media to share a lot of observations on the land, they can do it systematically while maintaining their own rights and observations and privacy, to be able to mobilize those observations for environmental stewardship. And so now, with one of the first projects that we did with SIKU in Senekilowak was looking at seal diets based on what Peter had started. So Peter had helped catalyze the design of that study. Inuit collected observations from like hundreds of seals over a couple of years, and then Lucasy presented at conferences showing the breakdown of seal diets, and how there's a difference in terms of the amount of shrimp between winter and summer, showing quantitatively, but using Inuit knowledge and Inuit being a part of every single part of the process, that some quantitative data behind those same sorts of things, providing that kind of equity. And so now, more generally, we've been using the app in Senekilowak to help do a resource inventory for our Hikatea protected area. And the whole community, there's about 160 people, have been actually making posts over the year about berries and fish, and crowdsourcing a resource inventory showing the timing of migration of migratory species, and all those sorts of things to really mobilize Indigenous knowledge. And it's starting to change the national dialogue even about, the value of Inuit knowledge and the return on investment of investing in Inuit versus academics. Because Inuit are really showing what's possible and how much they can really do, and you give them the right tools and invest in them instead of sending all the money to universities. So, yeah.
Right. Okay, fantastic, Joel. That's a really great explanation. And so maybe talk about where the work is now and what the kind of future plan is. And then I'm going to check the chat, Joel, and see if we're getting any questions. Please drop your questions for Joel if you have them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we launched the app in 2019. We did a lot of consultation with different Inuit groups, and Cree all across the north, regional organizations, youth like Nunavut, civic exhibit programs that helped develop features. But that consultation didn't end with the launch. The idea is we're a charity. The app can improve. We're adding new dialects. We're working with new groups like Inuit Nation, to add new species, to add new measurements to help support Indigenous communities do climate change monitoring and scale up the use of the app, to help empower different communities. So that work is ongoing. And based on that feedback and consultation, we want to add new terminologies around weather and water and snow and permafrost and women's knowledge indicators of climate change that help expand the scope of the profiles and the types of monitoring that can be done. We've recently added a lot of very customizable species-specific things, right? So that when you go to pick berries, the fields you see are simple and obvious and different from when you go to make a CO post sort of thing. That it makes it a lot easier and allows programs to kind of customize their approach, based on the species. There's a lot of project management tools that we've been adding to support communities using this as a tool for their climate environmental monitoring programs, stewardship programs, that in addition to empowering individuals to collect data on the land, that's empowering community members to take charge of leading and their project management, to facilitate their reporting, to facilitate real-time decision making by map filters, impact tracking. So a big thing, in Senekilluwak, obviously where we're from, there's like the most use, but we now have 11,000 users across the north, every northern community. Some of the big scale stuff that's really taken off right now, we have Ice Watch, where people are helping share their knowledge about dangerous conditions and changing ice all across the north. And if you look at the map there, you can see that Inuit have crowdsourced ice climate change knowledge for a couple of years now. The thing that we just started is the Goose Watch, so we're tracking the migration, Innu, Cree, and Inuit across the north. It's been a big gap that apps in south like eBird and that haven't been taking off as much in the north, right? But we can now see for the last 3 years the timing of migration, nesting, hatching. This year we're tracking avian flu to see how that's spreading, which is a real concern this year. It's showing that collectively communities can work together to document these really large scale pan-Arctic sorts of processes for climate change. And it's showing like the value of investing in Indigenous communities for that. We were asked by Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, which is the national Inuit organization, to do an impact assessment, a social return on investment, because in addition to like the resource assessment sort of data, we're also able to really show the sorts of impact, and tracking impact has been something that we've built into the tools for project management for communities too. And that was really exciting because we've been looking at in the pandemic, right? We launched right before the pandemic. And we had to switch to doing a lot of training remotely and all that. But the benefit is that it's about self-determination. So when communities are running their own programs with tools like SIKU, they're not relying on researchers coming from the south to be successful, right? And so when researchers couldn't travel, approaches that were taking this approach were able to still continue and thrive. And actually, we were able to track food security in the pandemic that was contributed to, as well as the resource inventory. And so we've looked at like the value, the return on investment of not just the work that was done and the income in communities, but also like the food security contribution to it. We've also been able to do a bit of analysis looking at, compared to some work that's been done on investments in academic institutions, right? What's the data per dollar invested return for academics versus Inuit? And it looks like 14 times is the preliminary number that Inuit have been doing, because they're out every single day, right? And some stuff we want to do in the future is looking at the carbon footprint, right? So what's the benefit of investing in Indigenous communities to lead their own monitoring programs, and versus like people from the south flying around in helicopters or on icebreakers? What's the data return on investment? What's the carbon footprint return on investment? For this stuff, all is a part of changing the dialogue about investing in Indigenous communities, and not just everything exclusively going to academia, and having some more equity there.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you, Joel. We've got some great questions here. You've already answered one of them, which was, please explain Goose Watch, which is the logo on your hat. So thank you for that. Next question. This is from our colleague Simon. Your community is looking directly at the effects of climate change and also experiencing it more directly, of course, and sooner than others. How does your community, and I'd say yourself, Joel, manage feelings of despair and loss? And how do you maintain your energy, agency, and even excitement?
Sure. Any small community, there's obviously lots of challenges, and things are changing, and people are adapting. And I think some of the outcomes that we're having from programs, like by showing what's possible by investing in Senekilluwak and in the other 40 communities that are using it now too. People are excited to see that, right? And go and meet and share knowledge and see that there's progress and see that it's being showcased nationally. And we've been able to help leverage investments in the Hecate protected area work as a result of a lot of this as well. And that's provided new jobs for people in the community. And so there's lots of challenges, sure, but we're not sitting around moping about it. We're out there trying to do stuff, and there's a positive return on that, which has been really exciting.
That's great. Joel, a question from Melanie. Do you have a sense of the adaptation of science to integrate and value Indigenous knowledge, such as the two-eyed seeing approach, as a more core practice? Do you think this will move, to become more mainstream as you're taking your work forward?
Yeah, I'd flip it a bit and say, like, maybe I think it's going to really show the power of Indigenous communities and what they can do, and that their knowledge and the power of their and in-depth detail of their knowledge systems as this really takes off. And so maybe Indigenous communities will be fine with integrating science rather than the other way around. And integration is not a word I like to use. It's about linking, making those connections and self-supporting each other. And so, like, I think it is going to shift the dialogue across the table to help empower Indigenous communities more and be more on track. And I think as a result, science is going to have to keep up. And it wasn't through the goodness of science or more, let's say, academic communities more accurately, to like be more willing to respect Indigenous knowledge frameworks. I think, and that has been increasingly happening, which is great to see. But
Hmm.
I think the flip side of it is actually like really demonstrating what's possible by Indigenous communities, um,
Right.
is helping change that a lot. So yeah, we'll see where
Yeah,
it goes, but we're pretty optimistic about that.
that's fantastic. Um, Joel, I wanted to ask you about the role of Eider. You speak a lot about Eider on your website, and I think there's a quote where you call um, Eider the canary in the coal mine. Can you talk about what that meant and how that came to be the name of your society? And sort of, I
Mhm.
think there's lots underneath that.
Sure. Our film People of a Feather is a bit of a backstory for that. So Seneca didn't have any caribou. They were wiped out on the archipelago when freezing rain covered up the lichen like hundreds of years ago. And so, being very adaptable, they switched to using eiders. There's a unique subspecies of Hudson Bay eider that spends all year. They don't migrate. They winter in the sea ice and plinias and flow edges and nest on the islands. They have the warmest feather in the world, eider down. And so the community traditionally used the skins of the birds to make their clothing instead of caribou. And then since about the 70s, started collecting down from the nest and putting it into textiles. And so, and it's been a main source of food for the community as well, right? And so Seneca really uniquely identify with the eider, and the film People of a Feather is really about that cultural connection, the unique culture, and a bit of the backstory about how changes in sea ice habitats have been affecting eiders. There's been die-off events happening, but this charity kind of came from the film and the unique relationship. And my PhD in biology was studying eider ducks because I was invited by the community to help understand some of the changes that were happening. But now we like to emphasize that we do a lot more than duck stuff, obviously, and that it's really a metaphor because eiderdown is the warmest feather in the world. It's the best of nature's technology. It showcases indigenous innovation. And even though we have a fancy app, you have to keep it in your pocket, and you can learn about indigenous environmental terminology on the app, but you still need your harpoon to check the ice, and you still need to learn from elders. So the app can help get people interested in being out on the land and doing monitoring, but it's not a replacement for indigenous knowledge systems and for learning directly from people out on the ice. So um, yeah.
I'm so sorry,
I
everyone.
guess.
Okay. Um, okay, thank you, Joel. Okay, we have a colleague, Alex, sending in a question about your work and how you connect research to new ways of telling stories. And what would you say are the main lessons you might draw from that, Joel, that others in the environmental movement could learn from?
From connecting research and indigenous knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's that, you know, there is a wealth of storytelling and Indigenous knowledge frameworks, and there are different ways that we of knowing that we don't think about. Not everything you can break down into quantitatively, like we've been talking about, but there is a lot of it that isn't just anecdotal, that it's really systematic. The language is classification systems and quantitative, and that, you know, we have a lot to learn about those frameworks from a science perspective. And so, you know, I think there's that as academics, it's easy to go up and be like, oh, I spent all this years in school and I know what I'm talking about, and nobody else knows as good as I do. But to really be humble and go in and take the time to learn, and you know, the
Mhm.
rewards of that are quite
Mhm.
substantial. Just take
Mhm.
the time to listen and learn.
Mhm. Joel, I think there's so much also underneath the way that you have co-created and sort of humbly come in and learned, starting with your kindergarten position in the community. And I wonder, how much of this is at the core of your impact so far and how it might inform other environmental work where the work is very based on fear and shame and despair. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach about just like you said, being humble and being there, and most importantly, being there long enough, right? Because a lot of people show up to the north, they're there for a year, a couple of years, and they get their thesis or they get a job, and then they use that to get another job, and they're gone, right? So I think the biggest thing is building that long-term relationship of trust. You know, it's
Right,
been 20 years that I've been working based out of Senekilluak now, and so um, that doesn't come quickly, right? It takes the time to do it, and
right.
so yeah, the approach, the time investment, and
Yeah,
it's easy to think you know it all as an academic. So
yeah, yeah,
um, you definitely know some stuff, right? But there's a lot out there to still learn, and especially people that are out on the land every day, they're probably
yeah,
going to know more than you learned in the classroom.
yeah, exactly. Um, okay, that's great. Thank you, Joel. Before we wrap up, we've got a couple more minutes. Is there anything that you'd like to say or share that we haven't touched on? And I'm just going to scan the questions one more time.
No, I think that mostly covers it. You know, the SIKU app is built to scale and to really support Indigenous communities. We've been mostly focused on Inuit in Canada, as well as working with Cree and now Innu Nation. There's some work to help take it to Greenland, Alaska, but it really is built to scale. And so just, you know, thinking about how similar sorts of tools, it's not the technology that we're super excited about. It's like really showing what's possible by and for Indigenous communities when they're given the right tools and they're given the right support and investments. And I think that's something that scales everywhere, and we're happy to help share the technology and for free, and help. It's built in a way that could be adapted to a lot of other different regions and stuff too. And so yeah,
So
hopefully it can have a broader impact as things build.
awesome. Thank you, Joel. So the links are in the chat. I really do invite you to check out Joel's website and the various projects that are going on. Take the time to watch the movie, People of the Feather, and you can reach to Joel through his website. And I encourage everyone to learn more, and support. Thank you so much, Joel. Pleasure
Thank
speaking
you.
with you.
Appreciate it.